early 90s, Sylvester Stallone needed a hit badly. When the decade opened, nothing Sly was doing seemed to be working. Rocky V was an unthinkable box office flop, and his ill-advised foray into comedy with Oscar and Stop or My Mom Will Shoot was a complete disaster. It was time for a back-to-basics Stallone vehicle, but even the Rambo series at this point was running out of steam. He needed a solid action movie that would allow him to stretch, but also remind audiences why they loved the larger-than-life icon at the same time. He would get all that and more in 1993's Cliffhanger. Enter Coralco Pictures. At the time, they were the masters of the high-concept action film, having bankrolled the Rambo series, as well as Total Recall and Terminator 2 Judgment Day for Arnold Schwarzenegger. As a kid, whenever I saw the Coralco logo hit the screen with the familiar Jerry Goldsmith music, I knew I was in for a total blast. They had planned to team Stallone with the late great John Candy in a comedy called Bartholomew vs. Neff, which was to have been written and directed by John Hughes. It never happened, and it's probably for the best, as Stallone's fans had been totally alienated at that point by his comedies.
It's bad humor, I know.
At the end of the day, this might have worked briefly for Schwarzenegger, but comedy was not happening for Stallone. He was then attached to two potentially huge films for Coralco, each of which got full screenplays. One was a movie about a futuristic train called Isobar, which would have had an all-star cast including Kim Basinger. The other was called Gale Force, which would have starred Stallone as a tortured ex-Navy SEAL who, after killing a kid in a drunk driving accident, returns to his hometown a hated man. However, when a hurricane looms and a team of mercenaries attack his small town, he becomes a hero, dispatching all of them in a plot that sounds an awful lot like what became the hurricane heist many years later. Neither movie happened, but the tortured hero aspect must have appealed to Stallone when he opted to make Cliffhanger, which was written by Michael Frentz, who would later write the James Bond movie Goldeneye. In Cliffhanger, his character Gabe Walker is a ranger who is dispatched to rescue two climbers, both of whom are his friends from the Colorado Rockies. One of them, Hal, is played by the great Michael Rooker, and he's supposed to be Gabe's best pal. The other, Sarah, is played by Michelle Joyner, in a role that feels pretty low in the credit, making her chance of survival slim at best. Indeed, the rescue goes horribly awry with Sarah plummeting to her death. Reeling from the fact that he was unable to save her, Gabe quits the Rangers and leaves town, only to reemerge months later in the hope of reconnecting with his former girlfriend, a fellow Ranger named Jessie, who's played by Northern Exposure heartthrob Janine Turner.
Why can't you just believe you did everything you could?
Now, it just so happens that while he's trying to get his girl back, a team of mercenaries led by John Lithgow's scenery-chewing Quaylen execute a daring mid-air heist of $100 million in uncirculated U.S. Treasury bills via an air-to-air transfer. It all goes awry, leaving Quaylen and his mercenaries stranded, and the suitcases containing the money are gone. Gabe and his former buddy Hal are the unlucky rescuers, and Hal is taken hostage, with Gabe being forced to recover the money in order to save his friend.
You, stay! You! Fetch!
They strip him down to a t-shirt in order to keep him weak and placid, but what they don't anticipate is Jesse coming to his rescue, and soon Gabe is using his knowledge of the mountains and superior skills to take them down one by one. Indeed, Cliffhanger is a rip-roaring adventure. Stallone is at his best playing the vulnerable but heroic Gabe, who's aided by a top-shelf cast of character actors, including Janine Turner, who was really coming into her own at the time, and the great Michael Rooker. Plus, he's got the ace direction of Rennie Harlin, who was at his peak in this era, coming off of Die Hard 2, Die Harder.
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
The action is ultra creative here, with the guys making an interesting choice early on. In his previous action movies, Stallone always used guns to blow away the baddies, but Gabe isn't a cop or a soldier. He's an ordinary guy, albeit a strong one with amazing rescue and mountaineering skills. When he kills, he does so using the instruments he would know well, such as an ice axe or a flare gun. Most memorably, in a scene that almost earned the movie an NC-17, he impales Leon's baddie with a stalactite. This gives the film a different vibe, making it easy to distinguish amongst his other vehicles. In a lot of ways, Rennie Harlin is the film's MVP. If you look at Sly's other action movies, it's relatively rare to see him paired with such a high-profile director. While Harlin's career has suffered in recent years, in the 90s he was one of the top 2 or 3 action directors in town, and he gives the film an epic size and scope that the other guys Sly would work with throughout the rest of the decade weren't really able to achieve. It helps that the location photography is gorgeous, with the Italian Dolomites standing in for the Colorado Rockies. It was lensed by Alex Thompson, who would shoot Sly's Demolition Man the very same year, and it definitely wasn't cheap, with an estimated $70 million budget, which is pretty steep for 1993. Indeed, Carolco would extend itself on numerous films, with Harlin's next movie, Cutthroat Island, sending them into bankruptcy. They actually had to split the rights with TriStar Pictures on this one when the movie needed reshoots in order to cut a scene where a bunny rabbit died a grisly death, something that test audiences hated. Sly had to cough up the necessary $2 million himself. Notably, Stallone also said that the action was actually pared down in the final cut, as Harlin had overdone some of the stunts to make it seem like Stallone was almost superhuman, leaping hundreds of feet in the air. The film also has a very good score by Trevor Jones, who was kind of a specialist in the action genre at the time, and it gives it a different flavor than a harder edge composer such as Jerry Goldsmith would. Plus, of course, you've got John Lithgow as the sneer-worthy villain Kalen with his fake British accent, and man, does he ever chew the scenery.
You know what real love is, Crystal?
No.
Sacrifice. Now I'm the only one who can fly us out of here.
It all added up to a bona fide hit for Sly, with the movie grossing a strong $84 million domestically, which was his best result in years. Now, if you consider the movie cost $70 million and the fact that it only grossed $84 million, you would think that the profit margin would be non-existent. But here's the thing. Overseas, it was a juggernaut, with the final gross something like $255 million, meaning it earned a hefty profit. In the years since, it's gone on to become one of Stallone's most loved movies. But something else worth mentioning is the effect that it had on the movie trailer business. The early teaser was scored to Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, and this style became de rigueur for years to come. Some years back, it was announced that Amy Lily Amirpour, who did A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night and The Bad Batch, would be doing a female-led reimagining of Cliffhanger with Jason Momoa attached to cameo. But so far, the movie hasn't gotten made, and hopefully they never do, because you know what? Cliffhanger is great as a one-off and is one of Stallone's best ever movies. I give it a 9 out of 10. Of course, Stallone and Rennie Harlin would eventually re-team on Driven some years later, and yeah, unfortunately it would not be quite the success that Cliffhanger was, and it's hard to see why. Stallone himself would kind of try to make a Cliffhanger-style movie with Daylight, which would kind of merge the disaster genres with the rescue genre, but the problem with that movie is it just didn't have a villain and was probably too far left afield from what an actual Stallone movie would be considered by his core audience. So unfortunately, Cliffhanger would be his last real smash hit of the 90s.
I want that money, and I want it now.
Quail, and the game's over. You lost.
Of course, that's not to say that Demolition Man and The Specialist would be flops. Not at all. They'd actually be hits. But the next couple Stallone movies would not do well at the box office, including Judge Dredd and Assassins. Of course, I'm going to get into that in future installments, but it would lead to kind of a lean time in Sly's career before he came back in a big way with Rocky Balboa. It has to be said, Cliffhanger definitely was the highest point he'd reach in the 90s, and I'll tell you something, 29 years later, it holds up mighty well. It's still a very, very watchable movie with great stunts, no CGI. It's an old-fashioned killer action flick that definitely needs to be checked out by anybody who loves Stallone.
Remember, shithead! Keep your arms and legs in the vehicle! And all!
The year 1993 was an important one for Sylvester Stallone. After a long string of flops, Rennie Harlin's mountain epic Cliffhanger was the much-needed international hit that Sly desired, with the film helping to reaffirm his position as one of the biggest action stars in Hollywood. But before that movie had ever come out, Sly was shooting his second film of the year, one which, in the end, would probably make less money than Cliffhanger, but would go on to achieve legendary cult status. Almost 30 years later, it remains Stallone's most popular and durable film featuring a character that isn't named Rocky or Rambo. That movie, of course, is Demolition Man.
Fucking A.
Well put.
John Spartan.
John Spartan?
That's right. They called him the Demolition Man.
Flashback to 12-year-old me walking into a movie theater in October of 1993 here in Montreal. Demolition Man would be my first Stallone epic on the big screen. Truth be told, I'd actually seen Stop or My Mom Will Shoot on the big screen, but suffice to say, after seeing that movie, I didn't really get what all the fuss about Stallone was. However, when I saw Demolition Man, oh boy, I vividly remember munching on my popcorn as the WB logo hit the screen while Elliot Goldenthal's amazing score started to kick in as the camera pans back to show the iconic Hollywood sign on fire with an on-screen title that reads Los Angeles 1996. While that aspect may make people laugh now, adding to the camp value of the film somewhat, let's not forget that in the 90s, Los Angeles was marked by chaos with the LA riots following the Rodney King verdict, obviously a big influence on this film's ultra-pessimistic vision of the near future. So in this movie, Stallone plays John Spartan, aka the Demolition Man, so called because he's always blowing shit up.
You are not supposed to blow anything up.
As the movie starts, he's trying to capture his arch-enemy, gang leader Simon Phoenix, played by a bleach blonde Wesley Snipes. Phoenix has kidnapped a busload of hostages, and in the process of defeating his arch-enemy, well, they blow the building up that just so happens to contain all of those hostages.
To hell with the hostages. This is between you and me.
Yeah.
Phoenix was the one who set off the bomb, but in the end, both men are blamed and sentenced to long spells in Los Angeles' new Cairo prison, which is kind of crazy to think that there was a Cairo prison in 1996, but whatever, suspension of disbelief. Flash forward 40 years, and while Sly is still in suspended animation, but Simon Phoenix is up for parole for some reason, despite being a mass murderer. Of course, he escapes his parole hearing and goes on the rampage with a little help from the inside. But the thing is, he's not the killer that he was when he went in.
I come out of cryo prison and I'm Betsy fucking Ross. If Phoenix comes out and he can access computers, operate all vehicles, knows the location of every damn thing in town, and is 3 times stronger than when he went in.
In fact, he's even deadlier because he's been programmed with all kinds of knowledge of the future, as well as superior martial arts skills, which of course is perfect for Wesley Snipes.
I wonder if I can play the accordion too.
Now, the society that he's been unleashed in is called San Angeles, and it is ultra utopian. You're not even allowed to swear. So what are these cops who don't carry guns and have never been in hand-to-hand combat gonna do? Pretty much nothing, because, well, Wesley Snipes just kills a bunch of them, rips out eyes, breaks limbs, has a good old time.
We're police officers. We're not trained to handle this kind of violence.
So what are they going to do? Well, it turns out there's still one competent cop left in Los Angeles, or San Angeles rather, Sandra Bullock's Lena Huxley, who just so happens to be a fangirl of the 20th century. In fact, one of the in-jokes in the movie is that her office is decorated with posters from movies that are produced by the film's producer, Joel Silver.
What I wouldn't give for some action.
And she suggests that they thaw out John Spartan and reinstate him as a cop. Now, Demolition Man could have just been a high-concept shoot-'em-up. Indeed, it was written as a hardcore action movie, but once Batman Returns and Heather's screenwriter Daniel Waters was brought in to give the movie a page-1 rewrite, well, let's just say things changed. He pitched it to Warner Brothers as an action movie version of Woody Allen's Sleeper, giving it a major comedic overhaul. Now, studio execs who saw the returns on Stop or My Mom Will Shoot or Oscar might have gotten a little bit nervous, but the thing is, Stallone's vibe actually meshes very well with Demolition Man, and he seems to be having a blast.
Let's go blow this guy.
Away. Blow this guy away.
Whatever.
In fact, if you look in his eyes, it looks like he's so utterly engaged by the material that Sly, well, just seems like he's having a ball. That said, Stallone wasn't the original choice to lead this movie. In fact, a bit of a lower rent version of this was actually planned in which Steven Seagal would play John Spartan, which is a ludicrous thought because, I can't even imagine Steven Seagal smiling. Plus, there would have been Jean-Claude Van Damme as Simon Phoenix, who probably would have been better as John Spartan and then have Steven Seagal as Simon Phoenix, but I doubt Seagal would have ever played the villain at that point. Oh, what a nightmare. Good thing that movie never got made. That said, Seagal at the time was probably Warner Brothers' biggest action star, with Under Siege his biggest hit ever. So you could understand why they maybe wanted to shoehorn him into the movie. Lucky for us all, it didn't work out that way, and Sylvester Stallone wound up signing to do the film with mega producer Joel Silver and visual artist Marco Brambilla at the helm. This would be Brambilla's first film, but he had tremendous success as a visual stylist with his iconic video for CNC Music Factory's Just a Touch of Love, having played to raves just a year or two before. The question at this point was, who would play the villain? Stallone was hoping that Jackie Chan, who he'd always been a fan of, would take the role. In fact, if you watch Tango and Cash, the beginning when he shoots out the window and the guys come crashing through the truck was actually lifted from Police Story. That said, Jackie Chan was very weary of making another American movie at this point because, he had already tried that twice before with The Big Brawl and The Protector. Both movies were complete disasters, and he was probably better known in the US as one of the Chinese car drivers from Cannonball Run and 2. So, his status in the US was kind of low, and they wanted him to play the villain. And Jackie Chan at that time was such a big star in the rest of the world, why should he play the villain in a Sylvester Stallone movie? So, alas, no Jackie Chan, but the guy that they got to play the villain was just perfect.
Home sweet home.
And in fact, they would still work in a nice tribute to Jackie Chan because at one of the hand-to-hand action scenes after demolishing some baddies, Huxley is asked where she learned her moves from, and she says,
Jackie Chan movies?
In the end, Wesley Snipes would play Phoenix in what became an iconic piece of casting. Snipes at the time was a huge action star in his own right, having made Passenger 57, which was a big hit the year before.
You ever play roulette? On occasion. Well, let me give you a word of advice. Always bet on black.
Phoenix would be a callback to his breakout role in New Jack City, albeit heightened to comic book dimensions. Notably, the character would be programmed with martial arts skills that would allow Snipes to show off some of his signature moves, with the rumor being that his kicks were so fast he had to slow them down in order for the camera to pick them up. While the action is intense, the film is arguably better remembered for its comedy, with Walters' vision of the future a pretty memorable one.
I have in fact perused some newsreels from the Schwarzenegger library, and that time that you took that car...
Hold it. The Schwarzenegger library?
Yes, the Schwarzenegger Presidential Library. Wasn't he an actor when you...
Stop, he was president?
In San Angeles, swearing is illegal with an automatic fine alarm going off anytime anyone swears, which leads to one of the movie's best recurring gags.
You shit.
Violations of the verbal morality statute.
So much for the seashells.
As Stallone's John Spartan can't help but constantly drop F-bombs.
But that's really fucking stupid. You think he wants to start a business?
Which is kind of funny because, Stallone barely really swears in his movies, but he just goes to town in Demolition Man. Notably, in the future world, people don't like actual songs, preferring old-time commercial jingles. And thanks to something called the franchise wars, well, every restaurant is now called Taco Bell.
No way.
And then there's also the 3 seashells, which have replaced toilet paper.
I'm happy that you're happy, but the place where you're supposed to have the toilet paper, you got this little shelf with 3 seashells on it.
He doesn't know how to use the 3 seashells.
I can see how that could be confusing.
How do you use them? Well, Stallone himself says that he thinks that 2 shells should be used like chopsticks while you scrape what's left with a 3rd. Ugh. Bullock, for her part, said it depends on what you're doing, number 1 or 2, with different uses for each. That also is kind of hard to figure out, Sandy. It's worth noting that Demolition Man was an important early film for a few big names, including Benjamin Bratt, Rob Schneider, and Dennis Leary. But of everyone, the one to really emerge as the biggest star with her status as an icon rivaling Stallone's is Sandra Bullock. She was actually a very late replacement for Lori Petty, who apparently didn't really get along with Sly, and Bullock's charm in this movie led to her star-making role in Speed, and the rest is, as they say, history. Her and Stallone have apparently stayed pretty close over the years, with her apparently the original choice to play the Eric Roberts role in The Expendables in a cameo part, but alas it never happened, which is too bad because it actually would have been really cool. Of course, Wesley Snipes would eventually join The Expendables himself in the third film, which would be his comeback role after a long spell in prison for tax evasion. Notably, when they break him out of this hellish Russian gulag at the beginning of the movie, he gives taxes as the reason why he was locked up.
So why'd you get locked away?
Tax evasion.
Given how iconic the film is, you'd think that Demolition Man was a major hit, but curiously, it was only moderately successful. It did open at number 1 at the box office on October 8th. Coincidentally, this was my 12th birthday. But the $58 million gross was considered soft in the end, although it did much better overseas. Still, considering how huge it became on video and cable, Stallone filed a suit against Warner Brothers years later, saying that the studio always claimed that the movie was $67 million in deficit, which really doesn't make a lot of sense if you consider that it easily broke $100 million worldwide. Eventually, they settled, and Stallone has always said he'd definitely consider doing a sequel to the movie, and indeed, it sure would be cool to see him reteam with Sandra Bullock, who, you might have heard, is doing okay these days. In the end, Demolition Man really is one of Stallone's best movies. It's got one of the best musical scores in a Stallone movie by Elliot Goldenthal, and it's also got a great theme song by Sting, who actually reworks a song by the Police, Demolition Man. How apropos. There was even a video game spin-off of this movie. There were a couple, in fact. I had one on Sega Genesis, which wasn't very good, but there was a really cool one on 3DO. If you don't know what 3DO is, though, well, who could blame you? I don't think it sold very many units, but a friend of mine had a Panasonic 3DO, and one of the things that was exciting about the Demolition Man game is that it had cutscenes that were filmed specifically for it by Sylvester Stallone. So you got even more Sly, which was something, of course, that as a child I absolutely loved. So in the end, Demolition Man is probably the movie of Sylvester Stallone's that stands the test of time the most alongside the Rocky and Rambo series. And to many, it even tops the Rambo films. Now, I don't know if I'd go quite that far. I don't think any movie that Stallone did outside of maybe some of the early Rockies really matches up with First Blood. But I'd still easily give it a 10 on 10. I proclaim it one of his best ever action flicks.
But there's just one thing I want to know. How's that damn 3 seashell thing work?
1993 was a banner year for Sylvester Stallone. While he had started off the 90s on shaky ground due to the failure of Rocky V and his 2 comedies, Oscar and Stop or My Mom Will Shoot, the back-to-back success of Cliffhanger and Demolition Man re-established Sly as one of Hollywood's biggest action heroes. For his follow-up, he would pick another action flick, albeit one that embraced elements of another genre that was quickly gaining popularity in Hollywood, the erotic thriller.
Put all this behind you now, or the past is gonna eat you alive. I know what I'm talking about.
I have to go. Wish me luck.
You like watching them die? You like taking them down? Now I'm taking you down. You're finished in the agency. You're going no higher. You're as dead as those people in her. We both are.
Flashback to 1992. The movie Basic Instinct was a worldwide smash and established Sharon Stone as the biggest sex symbol of her day. A veteran actress with a career going back a decade, her performance as the murderous but insanely alluring Catherine Trammell made her a cultural icon. She followed it up with another steamy thriller, 1993's Sliver, also a hit, and The Specialist would be her last entry into this cycle of erotic thrillers, with her eventually opting to branch out a little with movies like Martin Scorsese's Casino in a bid to avoid typecasting. But, for the moment, she was Hollywood's reigning femme fatale. The film was inspired by a series of books by John Cutter, a pseudonym for screenwriter John Shirley, who would go on to co-write The Crow. But in the transition to the big screen, virtually nothing from the novels was left intact, resulting in a screen credit that oddly stated the film was suggested by those novels. And looking at their synopses, it's easy to see why, as everything was changed. The film would eventually be written by Alexandra Saros, who wrote the remake of Nikita, Point of No Return for the same studio Warner Brothers the year before. In the movie, Sylvester Stallone will play Ray Quick, a former explosives expert for the CIA. When one of his bombs takes the life of a young girl, he quits the agency and becomes a killer for hire. He's hired by Stone's Mae Monroe, who wants him to eliminate a Miami crime family that's run by a father-son duo played by Rod Steiger and Eric Roberts.
After all, you're about to give me a new life.
Really, Will?
When you kill those three bastards.
When he starts picking off members of the family, a bomb expert played by James Woods is brought in, with him having been Quick's old handler/nemesis in the CIA. But very soon, Quick realizes that May has become the lover of one of his targets, leading him to question who is playing who.
First rule, don't go near them again. Second rule, don't contact me. I'll contact you.
Maybe I can help you.
In a lot of ways, The Specialist is the kind of movie that could have really only ever been made in the 90s, as it's part of two very interesting cycles that were going on at the time. One is the erotic film cycle, while the other is a series of movies that came out during the mid-90s about bomb making. Speed and Blown Away had both come out the same year, but the thing that made The Specialist unique in this mini-cycle is that, this time, the bomb maker was a hero. Within a few years, CGI would make old-school pyrotechnics a thing of the past, and the movie is fascinating to watch when you consider how much practical action there is. When it came out, The Specialist was reviled by critics.
You send it to me. Get rid of this asshole.
And indeed, it's a pretty silly movie. The director, Louis Lalosa, who would go on to make Anaconda, films the movie like it's probably the most expensive episode of Red Shoe Diaries ever, and it all comes together like a really pricey direct-to-video erotic thriller. It's not helped by the raunchy sax score by John Barry of the James Bond series, which is shamelessly cribbed from his own classic score to Body Heat. The love scenes, particularly the big set-piece one in the middle featuring Stallone and Stone, are hilariously over the top, with them stretching and posing for a camera in a way that's easy to mock. And of course they're in probably the world's most luxurious shower. Given how sexless movies have gotten nowadays, there's something charming about the way they go all out here.
That's pretty good, especially if you're an amateur.
And certainly The Specialist, if not Basic Instinct, is far superior to other examples of the genre, including the much mocked entry from Bruce Willis, Color of Night.
I don't really know who you are. What you do, you have all the power.
The behind-the-scenes story from this movie are pretty amusing, with Stallone always saying that Stone was sick of being a sex symbol at this point and didn't want to do the nude scenes. The two apparently had to get pretty drunk, doing half a dozen shots of Black Death vodka before getting started. To this day, the two remain friends, but apparently the shoot was tense. At the time, there were also rumors that Sylvester Stallone had many of James Woods' scenes cut after being advised that the character actor was stealing the movie. And to be sure, Woods is stealing the film.
Fuck you, Ray! Fuck you! You killed your bombs! How many? 10, 50, 100 before you lost count?
He's in full-on Alan Rickman mode here. I mean, he's merciless.
Shut up!
While Sly and Stone are acting like they're in a pretty sophisticated thriller, all the guys playing villains in this are acting like they're starring in pure pulp, which of course was the truth. Woods is constantly mugging, yelling, and basically being just James Woods.
Nobody says a word.
Meanwhile, Eric Roberts gets all oiled up to play one of the sleazy baddies and plays the film with a constant leer, which I have to say is kind of appropriate for the character. Yet, both guys are a model of restraint next to the late Rod Steiger, whose Cuban accent is one for the books.
Cut my heart out, Juno. And now you look, my son is lying in a box.
And he does everything short of cartwheeling from scene to scene to make his presence known. His efforts would earn the legendary actor a Razzie nomination, and I even remember James Woods mocking his accent on Entertainment Tonight.
He hasn't lost his sense of humor.
While The Specialist is indeed a pretty bad movie, it can't be denied that it's still so much fun to watch. In the 90s, it was probably viewed as a crushing disappointment for all involved, but it's a goofy joy nearly 30 years later with a fun soundtrack of songs by Emilio and Gloria Estefan of the Miami Sound Machine, and this really leans into the sexy, seedy Miami atmosphere. Stone, despite still acting as a quasi-femme fatale, also gets to branch out a bit with her character ultimately being revealed as heroic, with her trying to avenge the murder of her parents. However, it's bizarre that she's supposed to have been a little girl when she watched Eric Roberts murder them, but years later, they seem to be the same age, and indeed become lovers. I get that she's trying to trap him, but seducing the man that murdered your mom and dad, and then becoming his girlfriend? Ugh. Stallone fans have always been kind of divided on this one, as it lacks the traditional action you'd get in something like Cliffhanger or Demolition Man. It's more of a thriller, with Sly using bombs rather than brawn to eliminate the bad guys. However, you can tell the studio was probably a little bit worried about there not being enough action, so they tacked on a bit where he beats up a bunch of ruffians on a bus who won't give up their seat to a pregnant lady. Show 'em, Sly.
I believe there's a vacancy.
As Sly was in the middle of a resurgence and Stone was at the height of her fame, The Specialist was a pretty decent-sized hit for Warner Bros., with it earning $57 million domestically. The critics didn't like it, but hey, audiences sure did. And that's probably about the same amount of money that Demolition Man made, while it was an even bigger hit worldwide. Yet its box office was hampered in the second weekend when Pulp Fiction opened, and may or may not have stolen its crown as the weekend's top movie in a hotly disputed race at the time.
We happy? Yeah, we happy.
In the end, it was no Basic Instinct, but it proved to be Stallone's last North American hit of the 90s. What went wrong? 4 words. I am the law.
The law doesn't make mistakes.
Really? Then how do you explain what happened to you?
Until then, The Specialist gets a decent 7 out of 10 Stallones for me if you take it as a piece of likable cheese. If you're doing it as a real movie, then it's probably more of a 3 or a 4 out of 10, but as pure cheese, I give it 7 out of 10 Stallones.
Here's a tip. No failsafe.
I should pass. Yeah.